Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about how game music shapes the player experience. So, game music isn't just background noise, it's a storytelling tool that enhances gameplay and player engagement. So, in this episode, we're going to meet with a composer and game designer to share how he crafts soundtracks that complement battle mechanics, amplify emotional movements, and make indie games truly stand out. So, that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everybody, and we're back. And today with us, I have Tyler Mire. Tyler, how's it going, man? Great to have you on the show.
Hey, going well.
Excellent, excellent. Well, for those of you who don't know Tyler, he is the composer, producer, battle designer, and balance specialist for Something Classic Games. And you've done lots of cool things. You're like one of your earlier projects is Shadows of Adam, where you were the lead composer and developer for that game. And you've done so many other cool things too, assisted with like composition, testing, development for, My Familiar, Forge of the Fae, Pillars of Dust, and even Geomythica. And one of the cool things that about you in particular, you really specialize in blending music and with game design for these really immersive experiences. So please take a moment, tell us a little bit more about Something Classic Games and this really cool thing that you do, specializing blending all this cool music.
Are you sure you don't want to continually praise me some more? I love being praised. Just kidding. So I've been working with Something Classic since 2013 or so. It was a game studio we founded 2013 when we kind of reconnected. We had all known each other from way back in the day, early 2000s, in RPG Maker forums, and all reconnected that year kind of serendipitously and decided we wanted to make a game. And at that point, all of us were a little more into our careers. I think I was 25 at the time, something like that, 24, 25, 26. And so we started Something Classic. We started making our first game, Shadows of Adam. And that's when I kind of more seriously got into game music, because up until that point, I had been like a university trained like jazz arranger. I was a gigging trumpet player. At the time, I was working with a band. We were on the road. And I always wanted to do game music. And that was sort of my entry point to doing it professionally. Fast forward a few years, we released our first game, Shadows of Adam, and then eventually started to kind of grow a community of other games that a lot of us end up working on, which some of you listed. And it's been a fun little journey, and we're just finishing up our second game, a game called Quartet, which should be coming out this year.
All right. Awesome. And I kind of like that story too. And I'm sure a lot of us listening are have similar stories. It's like, you have a group of friends, you're doing your thing, whatever. Next thing you know, they're like, hey, let's do this. Let's make this happen. And then you start taking, those expertise and experience from, the day job and all those other things, in your case, music, and start applying it in really cool and different ways. So it's always exciting to hear that. In light of that and what you shared, though, I'd like to get to know you a little bit more. And to do that, folks, as you probably know, we're going to have Tyler go through the Q Box round, which consists of a few random questions prepared here for Tyler today. So, Tyler, are you ready for the Q Box round?
Let's do it.
All right. First is, what was your childhood favorite game?
Well, I wrote on the sheet Final Fantasy VII, and that's really true. But my slightly meme choice, which is like 50% a meme, is Pilot Wings 64.
All right. Fair enough. All right.
No, I will say I had a save file and I almost 100%ed every level. I've been working on it for literally 20 years. And my son was messing with my N64. And then I turned the game on and the save file was deleted. So
no.
I was so close. Some of those missions are really hard.
I think on the show here before, people have heard my frustrations with kids and games. And that's, I think, what you just outlined is the classic one. But hey, it happens. It's life.
It happens. It happens.
All right. Next is, what is your biggest gaming pet peeve?
Well, I mostly just play RPGs, so I will kind of specifically comment on those. I feel like what bothers me a lot of RPGs now is just bad pacing slash unfocused narratives. And the second thing would be sort of like too many trinkets, which I understand from a design point why it's done is to give dopamine drops at all points while exploring. But I think as a designer, when you do that, it tends to make you have to make the trinkets of lesser value. So you're just constantly being inundated by like kind of worthless things. And then it's like as a developer, like, okay, well, we want people to be able to find little things all the time, but we can't make them really good because that would break the balance. But also, if you just find 13 rocks, that's not as fun. So what if we made a crafting system and just like kind of just spirals into all these like annoying decisions, in my opinion. So yeah, those are my big pet peeves. And with the pacing, it's more just like how games are very chatty today. I'm not opposed to games with text or big stories. I love those kinds of games. I just feel like the loosening of constraints of file space and whatever.
Mm,
Scenes aren't as snappy. And it's not even a video game thing. Like I watch a lot of movies with my kids now, and I'm just like so impressed with the movies that really hold up. Like we watched the first two Star Wars, as in episode 4 and 5, with my son. And I was just really impressed how like piffy and snappy everything is, and just like you get it, you get the characters in the scene.
yeah.
You watch The Lion King, like every scene just like really sets up. It's not like a 30-minute chilling with my buddies talking about nothing Trails game. It's like it's real drama, like some real punchy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's funny. I'm reading a book right now that just kind of talked about that as one of the main points, and they used journalism as an example for it, and it's called like for the stuff that has like too much text, what they'll call eventually is burying the lead, which means
Yeah,
you,
yeah.
you keep burying everything in details or whatever. Not that the details aren't important, but you got to get to the important stuff too. And you're right. I see it in games. I see it in movies too. So great points there. Next and not least at all is the staple here on the show, which is what game are you playing now?
Well, I have two kids, and so I don't play much games, unfortunately, these days. The game I've been playing throughout the year has been this FF7 Rebirth, the part two, which I bought, gosh, in 2024, maybe a year ago, and still have kind of worked. So every like month, I'll play maybe an hour. But unfortunately, like when I do have free time, it's usually spent writing music, watching my kids, spending time with them, or working on Quartet. So most of like my free time that I would be used for gaming is Quartet time.
Yeah. No, and I can completely relate. It's like I have those same intentions, right? Oh, let's. Well, I think it's funny. It's like, oh, what if you got a new game? You kind of laugh at yourself, like, yeah, because when are you gonna play it? Because family, work, all that stuff takes over. But hey, we still love games nonetheless. So, well, part of the reason why we're here. So, at any rate, thank you for going through the Q box round, Tyler. So now let's get to the heart of the conversation here. And like I led in with in the intro, folks, was we're talking about how game music can shape player experiences. And that's some important stuff I think we can all agree with, especially Tyler here. So to kick things off, I just want to come in with and asking, like, in what ways do you think games, the game's music, the music of games contributes to its overall appeal and even potential success?
That question is interesting because I just feel like it's kind of a chicken or egg thing. Like we talk about a lot of games that have these like legendary soundtracks, but those games are all good games, and I'm not necessarily sure they're primarily a good game just because the music's good. I guess what I'm suggesting is that obviously I think the music matters. I think it can really punch up and really heighten the experience. But a lot of the soundtracks that have kind of become part of the pantheon are just attached to games that are really great. So people love, Chrono Trigger or Super Mario 3 or Donkey Kong Country, right? Those are great games that also happen to have great music. So it's hard to say. I'm trying to think of a game that's terrible but has a really great soundtrack and that like made the game successful. And I can't think of an example, but I can think of plenty of the opposite. Perhaps that's a little cynical. I always like to say, like, if my music ever was to become popular, it'd be attached to like a really great game, and it would just be because of that. I think my music's pretty good, but I can't choose if people like the game or not.
Yeah.
But I think, I do think like if there's like, especially in story-driven games, music can really accentuate the scene, can sort of provide subtext, character drama. things that aren't said, that don't need to be said, music can kind of fill in. Music can create a sense of atmosphere, can really create like little nostalgia hooks in your brain. When you hear like just a bar of it, you remember where you were, what you were doing. I think that's like the power of music when it's mixed with media. So I'm not to deny that it has an effect, but yeah,
Well,
I
you bring up some interesting points there too, because like, when you just called to like, the music could highlight something about a character. It could like give a little bit more detail about, the story going on or a character and all those other things. And what I find fascinating, and when you're calling out to this, I mean, I think it's probably maybe a little bit more mainstream, and maybe I'm wrong in saying this, but like when we think about, oh, those cool little details, that the visual details we see in games, you're like, oh, that little thing, it made a nod to this game, or oh, that. It's like music is very capable of doing exactly that same thing, and is very communicative in that way
mhm,
too. So it's funny though, because a lot of times when we think of those details, we don't always necessarily think about how music also
mhm.
plays a big component as much as the visual aspects.
Yeah, like music almost like gives you permission to feel a certain way about what the drama and the story is. I think that can sort of be what it's like the bridge to vulnerability or something. Like it
Yeah.
can just sort of like help. Oh, okay, I wasn't sure how I felt about this character, but the music's telling me I should feel, sympathetic or whatever. Like that
Yeah.
could be a big part of it for sure. And actually, I find that the most enjoyable music to write. I don't want to get too far into future questions, but I'll just leave that there
Yeah.
for
No.
now.
And yeah, exactly. It's like there's just so much that can be done that sometimes it's like and I get it. Sometimes it's a manner of means, like, hey, what resources do we have available? But other
Mhm.
times it could be something else that maybe we're forgetting about. So, I want to kind of now discuss a little bit about like music as, I don't know, like a marketing asset. Cause yeah, I'll be honest, folks, this is something I wanted to try to tackle for a while with people, because I could totally see this, but I also wanted someone else's take on it and everything. So, in light of that, like, how would you say that maybe, game developers could, potentially leverage music to strengthen everything from their brand identity to even, player recognition? Like, how can music be done in that way?
Yeah, I can think of like two ways off the top of my head. The first is if the music has sort of an idiosyncratic sound to it, that can help identify the game just from orally. Like, oh yeah, I hear that. That's Persona, whatever. You could kind of connect it in that way. I won't share too many games because it's the next question, but that's one way. And I also think just Chris Ewan talks about this a lot. Just anything that can confer quality to the consumer, I think is helpful. And sometimes like a big part of my strategy and niche as a composer is that like I have a lot of experience writing for live musicians. My day job is as a arranger for one of the army bands. I have a decade plus experience working with bands, writing concert music. So I have a lot of that skill set. But obviously, like it's really hard to afford, a 20-piece jazz orchestra or 80-piece orchestra or whatever. But I found kind of strategic ways to mix samples and get like a couple live recordings to sort of sprinkle throughout. And that can just denote a level of quality that feels legitimate and feels like worthy of player recognition. I think players respond to that stuff, regardless of even if the music's good or not. Frankly, they hear it. It's like, this sounds like high quality. It sounds like they really took their time and cared about the product, which is a little unfair to composers who maybe don't have the money or means to do what I do, but I just sort of like the way I see it. So I think that's a big part. Like, My Familiar is one game where like we've done a couple tracks where every part, every note you hear is recorded by someone. And it really does feel like pretty lively and energetic and of quality. And I think players will hear and go, whoa, this is like a full big band playing this melody. And it's really kind of cool and exciting. That can help just like strengthen the brand identity by saying, like, this is a quality game and we care about, getting good stuff.
Yeah, and you know what? I think and well, it's not necessarily related. It kind of goes back to what we were just talking about a moment ago about those little details or whatever. I mean, these details are kind of like can be bucketed into their own in various ways here. So it's not just simply about, hey, what's being used when we're talking about this, story element. It could also be like the quality of something, or how it's very distinct, or offers a very different perspective in terms of like, one idea when we were talking about earlier was like contrast, right? oh,
Mhm.
I'm supposed to feel this way, but the music is very different. So, ooh,
Right.
like, so many
Right.
different things. And to your point, those things and identifying other ways to, let's say, be creative with even limited resources can give you that recognition and kind of really stand out when people pick up those games and or see, even a video clip, they're like, oh, wow, that's pretty cool. I something different I might have picked up, and they might not be able to articulate that right away either. But
Mhm.
you're making some kind of an impact with them. That's really really cool. So in light of that too, I think you may have like some other examples too, if you wanted to share or whatever that kind of does that. That really leverages that music in a strong and impactful way.
Yeah, this game has like been on my mind lately, and I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because actually I know why. I'm starting a barbershop quartet with some friends, and so I've been looking for old music, and
Okay.
I found the barbershop pieces that were in the game Cuphead.
Ah.
Which is there's only two of them, which is kind of funny that I thought of that game. But Cuphead's an example of a game that I remember. Obviously, the visual style is very striking and unique in the sense of it's obviously not unique. It's unique for a video game, rather. That's really the key to feeling fresh. Take something that exists in another media and put it in the other medium, and it suddenly feels really fresh. Like Star Wars is what World War II and samurais in space, but it feels really fresh
Hmm.
even though nothing about it is really that original. That's not what you're asking. But anyway, Cuphead's an example that comes to mind with the music, the genre music, the time period music. I think that really helps sell the aesthetic. And, if you go online, you could look up videos of the bands recording the music, I believe, in Toronto. So that's another thing that makes help and market the game. It shows, okay, this game is high quality. We spent a lot of money on it. Chris Keevan always says that, but it's true. Like, there's like a sense of like, oh, this is a game that really was made with a lot of love and attention and care. I'm trying to think of other games. I mean, anything Nintendo puts out, usually the music is really good. I feel like they do a good job of putting out, good teaser stuff. Like the Mario Kart 8, obviously, they had a bunch of videos of the recording of that. That was really strong. That's kind of stood the test of time in the last 10 years. There's a bunch. It's just such a specific kind of question. It's hard to really think about it. But those are the two games, like a Mario Kart 8 and Cuphead, that can
Yeah.
come to mind.
No, I mean, I'm sure all of us right now can think of like so many different examples. One that stuck with me, and I don't know if anybody has ever, I'm sure some people have heard of this title, but it was a shooter, first person shooter called Elemental Gearbolt. But the music for that was like full orchestra, choir, very like gothic, dark, somber type
Mm.
music, and interesting storyline. I don't remember much of about it other than the music has stayed with me ever since, right? And to know that kind of impact that games can have with you, it's like the gameplay was okay, but it was totally different like than what you would expect for a first person shooter.
I see.
Um but another thing that I wanted to call out too that I thought you said that was really, really good was helping to sell the aesthetic. And because I think it's again another component that we don't necessarily think about is like we look at we like kind of the visual aspects of these of games that we're creating are kind of like the standalone main feature, and understandably so because in this age that we're living, sometimes when you're scrolling through like social media, we might not have automatically, the sound might be disabled, right? So that type of stuff. But it still is important to pair those things appropriately. Like, imagine, I'm just trying to think like, I can't think of a specific example here, but when you're scrolling through some stuff where you see something that it looks like the colors are very high contrast, let's say neon, and you're thinking, oh, maybe some type of like trance or progressive type music or something like electronic would really make this work. But let's say you're like, well, we got something that seemed okay, or just that envision a game with those types of like imagery, right? And then next thing you know, you have like bluegrass playing, like country music. That I mean, I'm sure there could be a unique take there, but does that really fit that aesthetic? And well, yeah, that's a total extreme example there, but I love that point you make because I think that's just as important as everything else that we talk about with visuals. The same thing applies to the music, unless there's a deliberate design and like a deliberate intention to do so.
Yeah, I agree. Like I call it like the game doesn't have the tolerance for music like that.
Mm.
There was actually a recent example of a game, not recent, maybe 2 years ago, that was like a high fantasy tactics kind of game. And I think just working within that genre, there's just so many audience expectations of what that soundtrack would sound like. And this soundtrack was kind of more like acid jazzy. And I think it really, the music itself was quite good in a vacuum, but I think they're just the genre expectation didn't have the tolerance for it. Now, that's not to say that someone couldn't come out and do something where the genre expectation completely flips on his head. Like there's no reason like I go back to Star Wars, when George Lucas was talking about making episode 4. He was talking about how he wanted the music to be very operatic and orchestral, like the
Mm,
great neoclassicists of the early 20th century, late 19th century. Like that was his vision. Like cuz you think sci-fi it's going to be like a theremin and all these like primitive synthesizers, right? Like that's kind of like the
yeah,
intuitive like thing cuz it's outer space. It's not from this world, but he wanted to go in a different direction, and it worked.
yeah,
So who knows what works and what doesn't until you try. But yeah, I do feel like there is a certain amount of tolerance. Like yeah, like you supplied an extreme example of like some neon, Blade Runner
yeah.
nightclub, and then suddenly like it might not work. Or
Right.
maybe you're trying to create like an extreme element of bathos where it's just like completely in contrast and silly and ridiculous. Then maybe there's a universe in which that could be immersive, but
Yeah, well, I mean, I maybe not the best example here, but like Firefly, right? Like that's like another space western, if you will. But yeah, lots of different things. One now we're on it. One last thing we're going to throw out is the as you were saying some of those things, I was thinking Final Fantasy 13 because there's some music like it was very consistent for at one point, and the next thing you know, I was like, oh, there's some jazz here. Oh, bossa
mm,
nova. Oh, like at
mhm.
random note, and then I was like, it was just pleasantly surprised, and it didn't necessarily fit, but it worked. And then next thing you know, it's like, in a way, it kind of created some memorable moments. If anybody has any from that game, but
So I'm sure someone does.
I'm trying to. I did. Anyways, but yeah, there's lots of interesting, cool things there. And and I think we talked about these a little bit too, but like in light of all this that we just mentioned and shared, what strategies would you say that you use to create music that, extends beyond the game itself, whether it's promotional content or others?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it just depends on what the particular piece of content was. I mean, I I would say that there's like, I mean, as a working composer, you kind of have to be a generalist and be a little bit good at everything. But there are specialists who like specialize in like trailer music and stuff like that. I would say that's not a particular strength of mine because the one thing that makes trailer music so different than in-game music is that it's timed out, right?
Yeah, to
Whereas
go with the
game music
pacing
will
and the
just
beats and stuff.
right. And so that can be really constraining and constrictive in ways that can be challenging to solve those problems. But I would say, like, I don't know. I think, like, with anything, your trailer is supposed to give a couple things to your audience. It's supposed to, well, first off, it's supposed to tell the person watching, are you the audience for this game?
Mm,
And so that's a big part of the music. I mean, it can sort of reinforce what the gameplay and the genre is. So you're supposed to tell like tone, genre, and sort of gameplay from the trailer. And if the music needs to be congruent with that so that you understand and getting the right message, you want to see a trailer and say, okay, I get it. This is a roguelike deck builder set in space. Got it. And the music should not be taking away from that. It should be accentuating that. I think it needs to be pretty one to one with the vision of the trailer. Whereas in game, music can have a sense of irony if there's some sort of emotional subtext there. It's way different. So that's why I feel like trailers are so hard.
yeah.
They're sort of just like the salad dressing of music. You're not changing the salad. You're just sort of making it a little spicier, a little more hot, little punchier.
Yeah.
Um, but I guess you don't eat salad without salad dressing. So maybe it's you got to have music. Wow, that analogy did some work. Wow, I'm impressed. No, but so actually, one example, I didn't do the music for this. I wrote the music for My Familiar, but Preston McCampbell, the executive producer, he put together a really nice trailer for the opening two chapters, and he commissioned an original rap piece by great artist Megaran. And I remember
Ah,
when I saw that trailer, I really thought that really helped to really sell the game really well. It's like the footage really took care of the genre and the gameplay and the tone, and then the music just like really sold the setting and the tone. It was just a really effective trailer. It kind of goes back to the bullet point. It seems like high quality because you got this really talented artist, really great rapper, really well recorded, well produced, and it just felt really bespoke and unique for the game. So that's one example I thought was like a really effective piece of content
Yeah.
to promote a game and be congruent with the vision of what the trailer needed people to understand.
And that's a great one too. And I don't know if we have time or even if you know the story behind that specific example in terms of how they were able to connect and get Mega Ran there. But as you were saying that, and I am familiar with the My Familiar team, and when you were saying that, I didn't know that about Mega Ran with those guys. But as you were listing that, I could boom instantly like when you were saying I knew exactly how well that aligned because of that imagery. So just by saying
Right.
Mega Ran, and I don't listen to a lot of his stuff or whatever, but I'm familiar with it. And just what you saying that it immediately like shaped the identity and just solidified everything super crystal clear for me. And I'm vaguely remembering these things too, which again, like another great way of this the type of impact things can create in what we're talking about. You know, as we get into this too, and talking more about like what's within means and all these other things, I want to kind of get into like because again I know some of us are probably thinking, hey, I might not have the ability to do some of these things and everything else. So let's in terms of crafting music, especially for the best impact we can possibly shoot for, what would you say are the essential qualities of a soundtrack or just of that make the game, whether the game or both, the music, memorable and marketable?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is there's sort of this hurdle you gotta kind of cross. It's the music can do no harm. That's the first thing. So what I mean by that is, make sure it loops well. Make sure the volumes are in good spots. That the mix is nothing really that's going to stand out and draw your ear. Like you want people to notice your music, but in the ways that are good. Like, oh, I love that melody. Oh, that little cool little riff back there is really cool. But you don't want to be like, ah, did that loop correctly, or what's going on? Why does that sound really loud? Stuff like that. So that's the first hurdle, I think. That's just technical stuff. Anyone can learn that. It just takes time. The second thing, I guess, would just be kind of like we said before, like the music needs to be congruent with. That's the right word, right? Congruent, because incongruent means not.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. I'm trying to sound smart by using a big word. And the whole time, I'm like, do I know? Am I saying it right? Anyway, the music, music needs to be in sync with the game. So for memorable, I still think that like music will be memorable if the game is memorable. But I would say like something I always like struggle with sometimes is like I like to write like I just kind of take a music first approach a lot of times. I get as much information about the setting and the characters and what's going on in the story. But I just try to write good music. Um, so like it could stand on its own. Like if you were just to listen to the
Mm.
music, it would be interesting and memorable. And then when it's provided with the context of the game, it would just be even more effective. That's hard though, because sometimes if music draws itself too much attention to itself, it can kind of distract. So that's always that fine line. But I think like in story driven games, like strong melodic hooks with repeating motives, I think are really nice. Even the layperson, I think, picks up on that stuff. Even if they can't articulate it or specifically notice it, I think that can help. But yeah, it just sort of interesting, good music that sticks in your head. I mean, it's such a dumb thing to say, of course, but like as far as marketability, I don't know. Like I guess just like I said, everything before, it needs to just like really when it's used in a marketing context, really be congruent with the vision of the game, do no harm, and sort of just like be punch up everything and really help still the vision of the game to the person watching that piece of content. Um, yeah, I'm not sure I'm giving a great
No,
answer here,
that's all
but
right. Well, I mean, I want to circle back on some of these things too, because you
yeah,
mentioned, kind of standing on its own, and as you called out, that can totally be a fine line because it's like,
sure.
and what you're saying is like, really is the intent of this piece? Because if it stands on its own, that's fine, but is it doing, like, is it adding, like, or taking away from the original intent, like to building up on that experience in the game, emphasizing those points and stuff like that. So really solid point there, because again, like I think that's a lot of things, and folks, you've heard me talk about this on the show in various contexts and capacities. But like, what is the intent of these things and everything else? And I think regard in what we're talking about here, like crafting the best impact possible within your means, all those things. If you're leading with the right intent and really exploring that the kind of that why behind things, you're more likely to come up with creative solutions than not.
Mm, yeah.
Because again, if we're like you said, if we were just leading to, oh, well, we want to have this so someone could listen to and be like, where does that come from? I'm going to go play that game now. Like, that's fine and cool, but is that the intent? Because that's
Yeah.
very different.
Yeah, it's tough because I feel like in some ways you don't want to be overly constrained by the intent either.
Hmm.
Like it's hard. It's like a high risk, high reward to step out of like the immersion to get something a little extra. I mean, it's the classic they didn't need to go so hard meme where it's just like a guy sitting at the piano on fire and they're like, write a piece of music for a monkey riding mine carts, and it's just like, some super banger. So yeah. So it's tricky. I don't know the answer. I mean, every game's different. Like some that's sort of one thing I try to figure out once I work with a new client or new director is just like what the tolerance for that kind of stuff is. Some there's very few, very little, and some of it's very practical. Like I did music for several years for a math game, and music by design had to be repetitive, immersive, and sort of smooth. Like it couldn't have big spikes and dramatic arcs because the music was sort of supposed to get you into like a meditative loop
Yeah, like a
and
flow
state
state.
where you could
Yep.
solve, yeah, flow state. So that I had to really think about. That was really hard for me to do because I get kind of bored of that music as a composer listening. But I had to sort of think of it like, okay, I'm not writing, music with a bunch of contrast and sections that flow to. It's like supposed to just sort of be static, and that's challenging. But it's other games like Quartet. I feel like I have a lot of expressive freedom to really try things and punch up as much as I can because I think JRPGs is like the one genre or one of the few genres that really has kind of allowed like a little bit of a jump ball as far as what you can do. You mentioned FF13, and I forgot to comment on that was that JRPGs for just some reason just have the highest tolerance for the widest diversity of music.
Mm.
Like going back to FF7, I mean, gosh, in within like 10 minutes of gameplay, you go from prog rock boss theme to orchestral overworld music to like little peaceful village
Hmm.
chamber ensembles. It's just all over the place. That's what makes it so exciting and fun.
And then
But
like,
like some
yeah,
games can't tolerate that.
yeah.
Some games like I've done a couple games that are very like 1930s, 40s in a casino, and the music's got to be kind of that. And
Yep.
and that's fun too, but like you can't have something that sounds like 1980s jazz or something. Like so it's a lot of constraints in that way that are interesting.
Yeah, it's again, it's about like finding that alignment, finding that consistency, and everything else. Because otherwise, I mean, you can like in an unintentional contrast. We don't want to do that because I
Yeah.
think ultimately that will and can cause friction with your players. Meaning, what am I supposed to feel here? And when you're creating that level of confusion, that's you're taking away.
Hmm. You're doing harm.
Yes, yes. I love it. One thing I want to go back on real quick though before the next question is simply this. You mentioned something about like at the very core essential is everything from like, making tracks, making sure tracks loop appropriately and everything else. I just wanted to go back and call out to say absolutely because in my own experience too with doing research on lots of different games, it's really interesting when I'm looking into the music and sound components of things. And that is like one of the biggest complaints that I think a lot of players have. But if those things surface, it's almost like this is what players will do, which I find super interesting. Is if that happens where let's say the music stops abruptly or it starts again at a moment where it doesn't like loop appropriately, people will willingly put on their own music and listen to that while they're playing your game. And just think about that. Everything that we've talked about up to this point, we're talking about consistency and alignment with the themes and everything else that's going on. But you create an experience where now people are willingly putting on who knows what. That is not creating an immersive experience or as immersive as it can be. The players like it's like they're self-medicating.
Yeah, it's just the trickiness of game development as a genre. We're not movies. You don't just watch it and it has a set length and it's an exact experience. Once you put that controller in people's hands, they want some element of control, and that might even include control outside of the game. So
Hmm.
yeah, I just accept that probably 50% of people who play the game are going to listen to the music. It is what it is. As long as the people paying me think it's worth it, I think it's worth it to have bespoke original music. But yeah, it's just one of those things.
Yeah.
What can you do, right?
Yep, it is. But I mean, you do what you do with what you can and everything. So, and you know, I'm curious now to get to the next question too. You know, in light of this, crafting music for impact and everything else, how do you ultimately ensure that the game soundtrack, its components and everything, both, does a good job with storytelling and really catering to that target audience and their expectations? Because we talked about this a little bit earlier in terms of like the genre and those types of things, but how do you ensure that it still delivers on all those fronts?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's just sort of like going back to what we had kind of previously discussed. It's just all about, being in line with the vision, doing no harm. And I don't know, I think one thing that I found really effective in music that can really help align with storytelling goals is there are certain things that, especially without voice acting,
Mm.
that linear story games cannot do as well. Like you can obviously have inner dialogue, you can have, you know, monologues or whatever, soliloquies, but I can give you a great example. So something like a big challenge that happens every time I start work on a new RPG. One of the first things I end up doing after the main theme of the game is, okay, we're gonna write character themes. Okay. Now, that sounds pretty simple on its surface. Okay, here's this character. This is what they're like. This is what the music should sound like. It should reflect these parts of their personality. So you write that, right? And then they try it in game in a scene and it fits the character but not the scene. So
Mm.
there's stuff like that. But I have found that sometimes like if you want to sort of something that's in the scene that's not in the scene but it's part of the character, but you want to highlight that in the character theme without it being too taking away of the scene, you can use just like subtle little contrast um to sort of provide that. Like my friend Pat Allman always talks about Cyan's theme from FF6. When you first hear it, it's when you're introduced to him, and like from the first note, you like get who he is because the first section's like this really like guarded and even like duty bound samurai, dun, 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 like really steady and kind of grounded, and the harmony doesn't really move. And then what happens in the B section? It like opens up into this like really expressive, open, emotionally vulnerable place. And it doesn't really make sense in the scene, but once you get to know Cyan's character, it's like, oh, that B section was just telling us who the character was before the story did. So that's one of those things I like. But it's hard because, I recently did a character theme for a game. We did it a couple of years ago, and I was approved, and it was to the spec of what they wanted the character to be like at the time. And I guess recently, when they finally got around to making scenes with the character, they were trying the theme, and it just wasn't working. So that's an example of maybe like the they are thinking more, okay, it's not really that we need this music to tell us about the character. It's more about the music needs to sort of tell us how to feel about the character in this specific scene. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I
So
mean,
I guess one thing to ensure that is just to make sure you get really clear vision from the person. Like, is this for just the character or is it for the scene in which the character is in? Those are kind of two different things sometimes.
yeah. No, I think it's important because again, I think a lot of times when we consider music, we understand its importance in terms of, emphasizing story or just the experience as a whole. But then in light of that, we may lose sight too of the other type of impact it has. And like you just called out, like as you were saying that in a different way, I thought of something else too, like, well, what if your character theme ends up trumping the main, the situation or the main scene that's happening in that moment? And let's say it's a very dramatic one or just some level of significance, right? But then you have this character themes that's like coming in like let's say like super, I'm sure a big one that could be come off as potentially obnoxious or way, or a way of drowning out another theme would be, let's say characters themes with a lot of brass or something, right? Like, and the next thing you know, you're like, okay, well that totally just did not it, like the feeling and everything else just was taken away now from the main intent of that. And but by itself, like standing alone, that character might be like, yeah, that's everything, it's doing everything right and represents this character, but now you're like undercutting. And I'm sure there's other technical things like, oh, you could lower the volume, but
Yeah.
is that really like these are all things I think that we don't necessarily always think about when we're getting into this concept. And understandably so. I mean, if we're just trying to make a game and get it out there, maybe that's not top of mind. But if you spend a little time to think about these things, it could potentially make all the difference. It's not to say it's going to be perfect. I mean, nothing ever is, but it's a lot of interesting things going on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like I mean part of that too is just like with the music that has been written, how do you use it in game? That's part of it too. Like I mean, in Quartet, there's 8 characters, and I wrote 8 character themes. But up to this point, we've only used 7 of them. There really isn't a place for this 8th one. Like, there's no story appropriate place where this theme makes sense to play.
Ah,
Partly because of how it sounds, but partly just because that character is sort of he's an important character, but he's always kind of in tandem with another character and kind of in a supporting role. There might
okay.
be a place later in his side quest where it makes sense to play. But I still think writing the theme was helpful in helping me and the people writing the story understand the characters. But another thing you could also consider doing is like, I mean, this costs more money, of course. This is more bespoke music, but like once you have thematic materials, there's no reason you can't do variations on that theme that do
Mm,
fit the specific scene. Like there's great examples of this all through Final Fantasy VI. Locke's theme. It's this heroic da 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 like big exciting orchestral heroic music that makes sense when he first enters the stage. He's like saving people and doing heroic things. But at the end of the game, when he's like reviving Rachel with the Phoenix Esper, it plays this theme, but it's in minor and it's just like sorrowful English horn playing it. So you hear it, it's Locke's theme, but it means something totally different in this context. Because if we played the original theme, it would just be completely dissonant with what the scene's supposed to be. It was supposed to be intimate, small, and emotional. So
yep.
that's another way I think you can kind of do
And
it. The easiest music to write, in my opinion, is just like this is a dungeon, and there are no scenes in it. It's like, oh, this okay, this is so easy.
but
Okay,
that was such a good point example, especially for anyone looking to be resourceful. Like maybe that could be a strategy in itself. It's like, hey, look, I just want this one main theme that could be somewhat adaptable if it's like, if it's done differently with different kind of styles, even maybe potential like music genre, or just like the pacing is slowed down and then it changes up, like, and then you're just using one track very creatively throughout the whole way, as opposed to like thinking, oh, we need multiple tracks or whatever. And again,
yeah.
it's not to say it's the approach, it's just one approach that could be repurposed and very probably done very creatively. I mean, again, this is it's so interesting because I feel like what we've talked about today is just so dynamic and so deep and so many ways that it's hard to really pinpoint any of this. And even and again, and it's not just about like how well a composer or whatever knows their craft either. It's also about how well everybody understands that vision and why vision is so
hmm
important, because if not, it's going to be hard to articulate any aspects of this, whether it's music or other.
Vision's the hardest thing to get. Big picture vision is like, in my experience, the thing most people struggle with in game development. It's very hard to get that wide a view, but it's really important. It's very easy, especially in making games, because content can take really long to make, especially in smaller teams, to hyper focus on only the thing that's right in front of you and forgetting where that fits into the bigger piece. And that's very, very hard. So yeah, I agree. But that's just stuff as as a composer working for your games, trying to like get that out of the stakeholder, trying to figure that out. Because at the end of the day, you're just there to serve that vision and help bring that vision to life. But yeah, it's challenging for sure.
Yeah, well said there. Well, I know we're coming on time here, so in light of that, I mean, we talked a lot about really cool, interesting stuff in terms of how music really can shape the experience with games. So based off of that, do you have any, tips, suggestions, or things you want to reemphasize based off of our conversation today?
Yeah, I mean, if this is something you want to do, I mean, just embrace the fact that it's going to be the long game. You got to play the long game. But I would also encourage people who I think there's especially in the younger generation, a big cohort of them who their only vision and path they can see forward is to write music for games. And I would just say to them, you should widen what the possibilities are you can do with your music and write music for anything, write music on commission for concerts, for chamber groups, for, community bands, for, you know, your wedding band, whatever. Like, don't just only shoot at the smallest target possible. We'll make the target bigger so your arrow has a chance to hit it. And that's not to say that you won't do game music. I do a lot of game music, but it's never been the only thing I do. And for that, I think my music's better. And it's made my life a lot less stressful. There's just a handful of folks I can think of in the indie space that just write music for games.
Mm.
Is very hard. So, but it can be done. So I would say just widen your target and just play the long game. I started this, I mentioned in 2013, it's 2025 now. I'm almost 40. Um, takes a while to get good at your craft, to get the relationships you need to get work, to get the gear you need. I mean, gosh, it's expensive. So just be patient, work on your craft, and play the long game. That'd be my big advice, I think.
Sweet. Well, really appreciate that. And, and that and the perspectives you offered us today. It's a really give us a little bit more thought and intuition in terms of how we approach, the music in games and everything else. I mean, there's just, I don't know. It's getting me excited because it's like I'm very passionate about music. So talking about this in general is just really exciting, especially as it relates to games. So at any rate, I can't thank you enough for being here, Tyler. But with that said, hey, if people want to reach out, connect, learn more about, something classic and quartet, what are some links or ways that people could reach out and learn more?
Yeah, so Something Classic's on Twitter. Just look up at Something Classic. I think it's without an I at the end. But if you just search for Something Classic, you should find us. And we're on Blue Sky as well. And my personal account is on Blue Sky. Just look for Tyler Mire. You can find me. I'm not super active on social media too much anymore, but I try to post on Blue Sky when I can. So
Okay, cool. Well, we'll make sure those links are in the show notes, folks. And again, Tyler, thank you so much for being here today. It's been great.
yeah, thanks, Andrew. It's a lot of fun.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.